So we're going to pick right back up where we left off in class, where we were talking about the difference between monism and dualism, with monism believing that, consciousness and the body and all of that is made up of one stuff, and then dualism talking about how a consciousness and the body, these are made of two different stuffs. And so one type of sort of dualistic idea was the idea of panpsychism, which is looking at all materials, all organisms have the potential to be aware, have the potential to have mental properties, even if these are very primitive properties or primitive types of awareness. So, for example, a a cockroach would have a different kind of potential level of consciousness than a human. And so this type of approach means that really anything, electrons, clouds, rocks even, could have the potential of having awareness. But we start diving a little bit deeper into this, and you can ask the question, well, are electrons, do they have a potential level of awareness? And so then do you dive even deeper into a sort of a quantum physics level and keep going and going and going? And so that is one of the criticisms of it. But what's really interesting is that it is a very catch-all approach, and it's kind of an agnostic way of looking at consciousness by saying that everything has the potential for it. And really, if you think about how, and we're going to talk about this much later, there's a particular theory called the integrated information theory, which is a pretty popular current theory on consciousness that does assign a mathematical value. It's derived from a pretty extensive equation in terms of being able to assign like a rating or a conscious rating to anything. And so by sort of default, integrated information theory is sort of rooted on the fact that anything can have consciousness, if anything can potentially have a score. So it's an interesting approach, and one that is something that we should think about. Now, we kind of picking up where we talked about substance dualism. And specifically, we talked about Cartesian dualism as a type of substance dualism. So substance dualism, basically saying that there's two different kind of stuffs. It's a very broad umbrella term. Cartesian dualism is a little bit more specific in terms of Descartes' idea of what that other stuff is. But substance dualism is just kind of a broader umbrella term. But one thing that you have to think about is that there's a lot of evidence against substance dualism, and something that we have to consider just in general of how we use our language to describe our mind and our thoughts and all of this. And so we've talked a little bit about this in class, but I really want to make sure that we kind of really run this point home. One particular British philosopher, Gilbert Ryle, really kind of nailed the point of saying the way that we talk about consciousness and the way that we empirically study consciousness are two different things. And that is super problematic, because if we are looking at empirically testing everything in a physical sense, right? So if we think about, looking at it from a very sort of monistic lens of not necessarily not looking at substance dualism, looking at it in a monistic lens of just the physical. If we're going to empirically test this way, right, we cannot use in our everyday verbiage things like in the head and the mind if we are not implying it's a separate place, right? So this is part of our vernacular. We talk about the mind separate from the body. So all of us by default, when we talk like this, are essentially using sort of dualistic language, right? So we're saying that the mind is not in the physical space or not shared necessarily with the physical. So using things like, oh, that's just in your head, and, I'm losing my mind. We don't really know how to talk about the mind as a integration to the body. We just simply don't, that's just not how we ever talk about it. We talk about things like our mind's eye. Just the way that we use these words is not the same way that we study it empirically. And so Ryle said, let's kind of look at this sort of he had this kind of middle ground between dualism and behaviorism, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. Now, behaviorism really takes out the subjective experience. And so this is a very kind of physical way to look at the world. It's very materialistic. It's very different than kind of what we've been looking at with dualism. Now, what Ryle did is said, let's not reduce these mental processes to physical processes, okay? We can say that, saying and thinking are the same, okay, without implying that it doesn't exist, right? So he's not saying that consciousness isn't real or that doesn't actually affect us or is affected by us, right? But what he's saying is that our behaviors are just not caused by some mysterious mental state, that we're going to be able to actually understand this if we solve the big problem, which we'll talk about later. And so this approach is looking at the view of the mind as doing rather than being. So rather than being in a state of mind, it's sort of a physical thing, right? And our mental and activities and abilities, they're not achieved through some separate mind entity. It's just a part of this same process. And Ryle was very open about saying that a lot of the philosophical problems that we have are actually caused by this misuse of language. Instead of thinking of it as a separate mind entity, sort of think about it all in reference to the same sort of process. That's kind of where he was going with that. So this kind of middle ground between dualism and behaviorism, he was the one that kind of was trying to bridge that gap. Now, if we look at monism by itself, right? So there's these sort of two ends of the spectrum that we've talked about. So this only the mind, this is idealism. This is an extreme view. This is the actual end of the spectrum of looking at only the mind, right? So it is this idea that, only the mind exists and everything else that is a product is just a product of the mind working. So think of like, not necessarily the Matrix, but almost kind of like thinking of a Matrix-like thought where everything is created by the mind, your physical body, the people around you, the earth, the situation, your environment is all simply a creation of the mind. So this is a very extreme view. On the other end is another extreme view, which is materialism. So instead of saying sort of like there is no mind, there is only physical. So it's only matter and energy. This is a very empirical view of the whole idea of consciousness, right? So there is no mind or mental force that's apart from matter. All of the laws of physics are in place. Remember this whole idea of, matter is neither created nor destroyed. Laws that govern matter exhaust all forces of the universe. There's nothing special or different or unique there. There's no room for non-physical minds or consciousness to intervene. If consciousness is a thing, it is a part of the physical process, not a separate substance, not a separate location, not a separate thing. Now, it doesn't imply that consciousness is reduced to physical properties, and it doesn't imply that consciousness doesn't exist. It just says it's just part or dependent upon physical properties, right? So it's not saying it's necessarily reduced to that. It's just saying it potentially could be a consequence or just depend on other physical properties to occur. Now, this whole approach takes completely away from the subjective experience because many will say, well, I feel this way and I feel like I'm in, my mind's eye, and I feel like I think about, the mind and the soul and the, conscious experience feels more to me, right? So it does take away that subjective experience. And more specifically, there's three kind of perspectives that really take away from the subjective experience. The first one, we're going to cover this one in detail, is behaviorism. So John B. Watson, B.F. Skinner may be familiar names to you. If you've taken psychology courses before, then you might be familiar with that. We're going to go into each one of these individually so you'll kind of see this. The subjective experience wasn't considered at all in behaviorism. They only wanted to look at observable behaviors that could be recorded in a lab. They were interested in kind of cause and effect. If we do this thing to this pigeon or this rat or this person, right, we would see a consequence for that. And we can directly observe exactly the behaviors that are done. So instead of asking like, oh, how did that make you feel? They were not interested in that. They were looking at directly observable behavior. That's the whole point of behaviorism, is directly observable behavior and how to record that in a lab. Identity theory is looking basically in stating that mental states are identical to brain states. There is nothing different there. They are the exact same thing. There's no point in trying to differentiate because mental states are brain states. And then finally, this idea of functionalism, which comes from William James. Now, William James was heavily inspired by Darwin, and basically said that mental states are equal to functional states. And functional states is anything that a particular species has found adaptable at some point in their existence. So even if that behavior is not adaptable today, William James would say, at some point that was important for the species survival, and even though it may not be, it still serves a function, and that function's purpose might be no longer relevant, but that's the reason why this behavior has lasted this point. So you might think, like, for example, a functional behavior might be to be able to feel connection and love from a parent to a child. Well, functionally, that behavior is important because that means survival of the infant or the baby or the child, right? So if there are behaviors that are supportive of the survival of that child, so let's say the mother, the caregiver is a mother, the mother is loves the child, that and then cares for them so that they are able to continue to survive, then William James would say, well, love is a product of hormones, which creates a functional behavior of caregiving, which is then very important for that species survival. And we have behaviors today that can be explained potentially by evolutionary psychology that are not adaptable today, but maybe were, 200, 300, 400 years ago, or even 100,000 years ago, but aren't functional today. So William James believed and wrote that mental states are basically functional states, and they're equal and they're not separate. So let's jump a little bit into kind of where philosophy meets psychology. So in the 18th century, of course, the way the psychology started out, it was basically this philosophy of mental life, right? It started to kind of pick up as more of a science as time went on, and that was about the end of the 19th century. So at first it was kind of an extension of philosophy and started to take on its own life. Wilhelm Wundt is a German physiologist, so remember a lot of these early founding fathers of psychology were actually not psychologists because there were no psychologists. A lot of them were physiologists, physicians, worked in anatomy, things like that. So Wilhelm Wundt actually is considered as the founder of psychology because he had the first lab of experimental psychology in 1879. This is not in the U.S., but he was, kind of this kind of worldwide influence on psychology. And he helped develop things like introspection, which is self-observation, to try to understand the subjective experience. So he was very interested in what he could observe and what he could get from people that could kind of provide insight into a person's experience. And so he believed that there were two kinds of psychical elements. and that every conscious experience depended on the union of these two elements, and could be reduced down to atoms, actually. So the first one is sensory elements. These are simple sensations like tone, heat, light, kind of being able to break this down physically. And then the interpretation of that would be the affective elements, as affect is often kind of translated as emotion and feeling in psychology. So the affective elements were the simple feelings like sensory pleasure, displeasure. So you would have these sensory elements who'd break this down, this experience, the subjective experience down is like, what are the very basic bones of this, and then what is the interpretation that the person has. And in the one of Wundt's students, for example, Edward Titchener, another kind of very important figure in psychology, also used introspection to look at sensation as well as attention. And attention is something that's really important also in the study of consciousness. This level of awareness of, paying attention to things around you and being able to understand and be aware of what is going on. So Wundt was a very important figure in psychology. And then I'm skipping around just a little bit. So we're talking about, because we talked about this idea of, I was going to tell you about behaviorism, identity theory, more so behaviorism, functionalism. So we're kind of moving into this idea of functionalism first by talking about William James. So I'm skipping around just a little bit, but just kind of recognize that we'll talk about behaviorism last in this series. So William James was a monist and was looking at psychology in a much more scientific lens. So looking at psychology by using the scientific method. He published The Principles of Psychology in 1890, which was a landmark text that really got people thinking about psychology in a different way. William James talked a lot about and studied a lot about studied a brain injury. He studied how people reacted to drugs and alcohol, and wrote about how consciousness is affected by injury to the brain, different kinds of substances, and was very interested in looking at sort of the cause and effect of that, right? So he thought about consciousness as being affected by physical processes, which again was really impactful at that time to say that, this is, we can actually influence consciousness by seeing, this cause and effect. So he also wrote about this idea of stream of consciousness, which is basically consciousness is everything. It's sort of the past, the present, the future all in one. It's a flowing succession of thoughts, ideas, images, and feelings. It's an idea of your present state, but also being able to look ahead and look behind. Thinking of a stream as kind of, being able to look out in the perspective of the stream. And integrated science, right? He saw consciousness as in psychology as an integrated science of mental life. He was really, really influential, again, in this idea of psychology as a science and building on anatomy, physiology, and psychophysics as building blocks of psychology. And just as a reminder here that psychophysics is looking at the relationship between physical stimuli and sensations. So tying together, if I place this heated coin on this person's arm, that is going to cause them to experience heat and potentially a pain, right? So what is the subjective experience and interpretation of those physical elements to that person? And remember, I was also interested in this idea of looking at behaviors as a functional state. So saying, what is the sort of, why do people behave this particular way? And really it all comes back to this idea of evolutionary psychology, because he was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin and evolutionary theory. Now, let's skip now to the behaviorism. So these are the behaviorists. And so the issue that we have with behaviorism is that it kind of put a halt to the study of consciousness, because they were interested and took kind of William James' idea, even a step further, and the different perspectives of looking at psychology as a science, but then only looked at it at the directly observable behavior. And so because they were very not interested in the subjective experience for a few decades, it dampened the study of the subjective experience because they were so focused on directly observable behavior. And so they all, really for about a half a century, kind of restricted psychology until about the 1960s because they were so interested in just one little piece of the giant puzzle. They believed that consciousness was potentially an epiphenomenal experience, and that was essentially that it's just a consequence, and really they didn't really want to continue on and even study it. And so when we look at the three kind of biggest names in behaviorism, we have Ivan Pavlov. And Ivan Pavlov was not a psychologist. He was a Russian physiologist. He was looking at digestion in dogs and discovered that dogs were able to associate a stimulus, which is completely neutral, to an automatic, able to take a neutral stimulus and then relate it to a behavior. So in essence, at first he would, feed dogs with their food, and they would get excited and start to drool, and that's an automatic thing, right? So dogs don't need to learn that. They, it's what we call an unconditioned stimulus. Food is an unconditioned stimulus. It's something that a dog is going to react to regardless. He was able to actually get dogs to have that drooling behavior even with a stimulus that is not natural, which in this case he used the sound of a bell. So he was able to condition these dogs to have a natural reaction to something that was a not natural stimulus. And we call that now a conditioned stimulus. So he kind of did this a little bit by accident because he wasn't interested in the psychology of dogs and this idea of this kind of conditioning, but it just so happened that he made some observations and then started, kind of experimenting with what would make the dog drool and what wouldn't, and that's kind of how we ended up understanding a lot of this type of conditioning, what we call classical or Pavlovian conditioning. And so the idea behind this is natural behavior, right? An involuntary reaction. So voluntary reactions can be the drooling, it can be happiness, it can be fear, things like that. John B. Watson was also interested in principles of learning, and he was very famous for the little Albert experiment, which is basically he was doing kind of like how Pavlov was interested in dogs and this natural reaction of drooling. John B. Watson was interested in this a reaction of fear. And so this is a natural, reaction. And so he was well known for taking little baby Albert and having him sort of being fearful of different things like rats and bunnies and things like that. And so he was, basically took the stance of, the reason why behaviorists, our whole goal is to understand and discover these, fundamental principles of learning. And that's how all behavior is. And we know that that is not how all behavior is acquired and modified, but and he was basically saying, well, all behavior is acquired and modified based off of how the environment reacts. And it's like, yes, we do know that a good portion of behavior is like that, but we know a lot more. It was more of a much more restricted way of thinking. And then finally, B.F. Skinner, again, very famous name in behaviorist work, basically said he was a very true, very traditional behaviorist, and said that, psychology in of itself should only look at what we can study in terms of directly, outwardly observable behaviors that we can measure. We can do an experiment in the lab. We can gather that data. We can verify it. We can repeat those experiments. And that is how we should only study psychology. So he, had a very restricted view of what psychology should look at. And really, if we all only did what he suggested, then we would know nothing about consciousness or the subjective experience or how people feel about anything because we wouldn't be studying it at all. So it was a very restricted view. He contributed a ton to the field. And gave us a lot of information about voluntary behavior and how consequence and things like reinforcement and punishment affect our behaviors. He started in looking at pigeons and rats and different animals and really contributed a lot to psychology. But again, this really destroyed, for a period of time, destroyed our advancement of knowledge on consciousness because the behaviorists were very influential during that time and restricted the study of psychology. Now, the works of Carl Jung, for example, brought back this idea of studying the subjective experience and studying consciousness. The 1960s countercultures movement also brought back this idea of looking at consciousness. And so it's kind of had this really interesting kind of like kind of up and down. So this kind of waxing and waning in terms of being kind of in and then out and then in and out. And then another really big movement that brought it back was in actually the 1990s. And so there was a really big explosion